In today's episode, I'm joined by historian Alexandra Birch. Alexandra is a historian of mass atrocity in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and she's also a professional violinist. Her latest book is called Hitler's Twilight of the Gods: Music and the Orchestration of War and Genocide in Europe. So in this episode, we sat down and had a discussion about some big picture questions related to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. I got her thoughts on the human psychology of what it takes to commit acts of horror in this context. We talked about the connection between music and Nazi ideology and Nazi identity, what types of composers or types of music that Nazis focused on and why they promoted some types of music and regulated others. We discussed how music played into Nazi ideology and how it was used in the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, how Nazis used music to help perpetrate genocide and to strengthen Nazi identity. And we also talked about what changed or didn't change in the post-war context for Nazi perpetrators. I also asked her about some tropes and misconceptions surrounding how victims and perpetrators engaged with music and sound during the Holocaust. Alexandra also has some very interesting theories surrounding what she calls soundscapes, that are these totalizing combinations of sound, noise, and music that victims had to deal with on a daily basis, and how those totalizing soundscapes impacted their psychology, the realities of daily life in concentration camps. I asked her about how victims may or may not have reasserted their identities and their humanity through the use of music after the war. We talked about the psychology of victims and perpetrators, the general ideology of Nazism and its connection to mythology, and we also talked about some modern issues of Holocaust denialism and the role of museums in maintaining Holocaust history. I think there's a lot in this one. I really enjoyed it. If you're interested in Nazi history or the Holocaust or World War II or how music and sound connect to memory and psychology, I think this will be an interesting one for you. So I'm very grateful that Alexandra Birch was able to come on and spread her knowledge and wisdom on these matters, and I hope you enjoy it as much as we enjoyed putting it together. Thanks for listening. I thought we could start with, I guess it's not every day that you see a professional violinist also be a professional historian, so maybe you could talk about your background and kind of your history as a musician and what ended up leading you to the Holocaust.
Sure. So I did my bachelor's, master's, and doctor of musical arts in violin performance. I was very fortunate throughout all of my violin degrees, which are, of course, very performance focused. We do recitals in addition to writing a dissertation, that I had very strong academic support. So I had Sabina Feist was a close mentor, and she's this tremendous musicologist who does exile music, among other things. And then I also had this fantastic violinist mentor who allowed me to do things like recovered music concerts, right? So I did a recovered music concert for one of my DMA recitals. And I went to this fantastic, I always give it a shout out, fantastic seminar group of people on the Holocaust in the USSR, just to kind of expand my own research interests that the United States Holocaust Museum has. And it was such a wonderful cohort of people. And I realized how many resources there are to do research with music, and specifically music and genocide studies, that I decided, okay, this is something to pursue. I ended up doing my postdoc at the United States Holocaust Museum, and then during COVID stepped back into academia, realizing that I needed the additional rigor of an academic doctorate in addition to my performance one to do the kind of research I needed to do. So I finished my PhD in history last year in 2024 from UC Santa Barbara.
Yeah, so the book is about the role that music and kind of also more generally just sounds in general played in the Nazi rise to power, and obviously the atrocities of the Holocaust and even after the war.
Mm-hmm.
and how music was connected to Nazi identity and how it contributed to the Holocaust and all these different things and just the war in general.
Okay.
Um, so, where do you think kind of the story of music and the Nazis really gets started? Like, I was kind of struggling,
Mhm.
where do we start this thing? Just because,
Sure.
um,
Well, I was curious. I mean, one of the questions that kept coming up to me first as a performer was this villainization of Wagner and of people like Richard Strauss, who, I mean, Wagner died before the Nazi Party ever came to power, right? Richard Strauss had a much more complicated relationship where he tried to intercede on the behalf of family members, but he also was a party member. People like Herbert von Karajan, the conductor, were party members. People like Furtwängler, I don't believe he ever joined the party, but he was, sympathetic, but also yet booted from the podium. So there were all these performers kind of caught in this Nazi nexus. And I was curious about why there was this aesthetic fixation with like Wagner specifically and also Strauss, and how far that extended and how accurate that was to say that it's really Wagnerian. What I found is that the command actually listened to, I mean, yes, they had this Wagnerian specific obsession, but this was linked to a larger kind of Teutonic worldview, and they actually had this aesthetic fixation within classical music on all sorts of composers that they thought bolstered a German nationalistic view. So, like certain compositions of Beethoven, even one of the most ridiculous things I found is in this Nazi race and music book, they had labeled the Russian composer Tchaikovsky as being Dinarish, or as being like Northern German, like this Proto Germanic nationalistic ideal, which is of course ridiculous, right? Tchaikovsky was not only a Russian, he was a gay man. So this is they co-opted composers for their own worldview. And so I was interested in that as a starting point for the book, like how durable this was for the command. I actually worked on the interwar chapters of the book, so like the rise of Nazi power and then the collapse at the same time. So I approached it from both ends of the war. I was curious how durable this identity was in destruction, right? So like, what are they listening to in the last days of the war? And what it led me down was a whole rabbit hole of like these commandants and camps trying to prove themselves not only as genocidal maniacs, but also culturally to the Third Reich. We saw songbooks being issued to troops, songbooks with very specific messaging and very specific, um, I wouldn't say instrumentation, but very specific text. Um, and that's fascinating to me, right? Because if you look at it in the context of other modern warfare, this seems to be something very specific to the Nazi case, right? We don't have this homogenized um, cultural output really at the high levels of the command in other totalitarian regimes, even really the Soviet Union. I mean, I do a lot of work comparatively with the Soviet Union. I would not say that you could draw cultural parallels from 1917 to 1980, for example, in the Soviet Union. And that
hmm.
could, of course, that could deal with the time frame, but that was kind of my starting point with the book.
What do you think the Nazis, and I guess when I say the Nazis, I generally mean Hitler and the high command, at least at the beginning. So when they're rising to power in the 20s and when they're first kind of in power in the early 1930s and they're doing all this Nazi stuff where they're trying to establish a culture, and there's a whole propaganda operation, and
Mhm.
that includes culture and arts. And I guess I didn't know as much until I read your book, but music played a role. So what types of music did the Nazis think were good Nazi music? And you being an expert in actually the how to play music, like, did it depend the actual nuts and bolts of the music, like the notes and the tones and the sound, or was it more, what you might think of typical Nazi being like what the ethnicity of the composer was, and how Jewish or communist they were?
Sure. So it's a little bit of both. What you see from the high command is you see generally a group of men who fashion themselves as being extraordinarily cultural people. For some, this was a facade. So for Hitler, certainly this was in my opinion, a position that he wanted to represent himself as. I don't know how truly cultured somebody like Hitler was. I mean, he spent a good amount of time in Vienna. He went to the opera, he went to art school. He certainly had a fixation with certain types of music and certain types of like specifically things related to a Teutonic worldview. So Wagnerian myth was very attractive to him. This is in contrast to people like Goebbels, who were extremely educated. Goebbels had a PhD. He did theater very seriously. He practiced. This is why he was such a formidable orator. He practiced in front of triptych mirrors, giving speeches all the time. He was extremely fixated with self-image, very well read. And people like Goering as well, they knew visual art quite well. I mean, I think Goering, people would say he had quite crass or bombastic tastes, but he was very educated about things like visual art. So I think that it runs the gamut of throughout the command. Um, as far as what they actually knew about the content of classical music, that's a little bit more squirrely. I don't think that any of them were well trained in things like musicological analysis. They had people like Herbert Gehrig, the Nazi musicologist, who wrote books essentially outlining what Nazi cultural policy should be. But like the famous pamphlet of Entartete Musik, right, which followed, or Degenerate Music, which followed a show of degenerate art that Goebbels signed his name to, is really not musicological in analysis. It talks about pieces that they don't like, Arthur Schnabel, Arnold Schoenberg. They talk about these composers as being unintelligible or degenerate, in the same way that they talk about visual art that's not representational, being degenerate. Um, I think in general that reflects a 20th century broader totalitarian discomfort with abstract music and abstract art. We see the same thing in the Soviet Union. We see the same thing in Nazi Germany. I mean, where the Soviets called 12-tone music and the sort of serialist music, they called it formalist or hard to understand, right? We see the same thing in the Nazi case, but what we see in the Nazi case is an additional level of assigning ridiculous racial characteristics to music that would not be considered formalist or would not have these kind of unintelligible characteristics. The big ones being people like Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn, Meyerbeer, the composer Meyerbeer. So composers like this were denounced purely because of their ethnicity, right? The busts of Mendelssohn were taken out of the concert house in Leipzig, for example. Um, and so you see this, you see both a racial and an ethnic denunciation. And it worked really well for the Nazis when they had both a racial and an ethnic reason to denounce somebody, right? So somebody like
Mhm.
Sternberg, they could say, oh, he's not an Austrian, he's a Jew, and his music is this, we don't understand it. But this also becomes ridiculous in the case of somebody like Erich Wolfgang Korngold, because Korngold was, I mean, he fled to the United States, but he became this prolific film composer in the United States. His music is extremely tonal. His music from the 1920s and 30s are these beautiful, like operetta melodies. I mean, even somebody like Kurt Weill, the music is very attractive. It's operetta type music. I mean, the Three Penny Opera is extremely famous. But it also had these kind of jazzy Weimar sentimentalities. So there again, you see an overlap between aesthetics and race, where jazz is associated not only with Jews, but with African Americans and with Americanism. So jazz is kind of denounced wholesale with that. Yeah.
So you mentioned Teutonic myth there,
Mhm.
and in your book, I think you sort of say that there's all kinds of weird ways that religion and paganism and these weird sort of ancient mythological stories where the Nazis are trying to connect whatever their movement is in that moment with these sort of ancient, quote unquote, ethnic German stories. So, what do you think is the connection between music and sort of this mythology that the Nazis were trying to connect it to?
Yeah, I mean, I think music is the most aestheticized version of the Teutonic myth that the Third Reich was trying to situate themselves within. So, from my understanding, the Third Reich is this, the way that they conducted their statecraft was in this kind of Finis Germani, the final German, the prototypical German man, um, creating this very idealized view of race, of German ethnicity and culture within a historical continuum, of German technology and racial superiority in things like developing for example, industrial products or infrastructure products, um, and also in removing any alterity from that situation, right? So removing Jews and Roma and Germans who disagreed with this, and um, even like Catholics who didn't fit with it. Like, so when they get to the case of Poland, right, removing Catholic priests and so on who disagreed with kind of the Nazi worldview of Weltvorstellung. Um, and so Teutonic myth you see as this bedrock for what was the original or the primordial German. And then you see this fixation with historicizing the Third Reich. So we know that Hitler, we know that Goering, both of them studied battle plans going all the way back to ancient Rome. Um, a lot of the great campaigns were named after either generals, historical figures. So, like Barbarossa, of course, comes to mind with the campaign against the Soviet Union. Valhalla, there's all of the Führer bunkers were named after Wagnerian myths, right? So, like the Eagle's Nest, referring to the Adler, the Eagle's Nest in Ring. Again, Brunhilde was a planned bunker. I believe that the one in Vienna was Siegfried. So they all have these ties to Wagnerian myth. So they're very much what we see with Hitler is him casting himself as the idealized Sieger, as this idealized hero within German myth. And that could be he's Frederick the Great, right? And he's saying, I'm this brave king, I'm, Frederick the First, or it's him saying, I'm Siegfried. And so I think that music was this really reinforcing component of that. When they're listening to Wagner, it's a direct link to the myth, right? It's this very clear, okay, we believe in this Teutonic worldview. But then when they're listening to something like Beethoven, it's casting themselves in like a Napoleonic view, for example. So they're also seeing these different kind of, right, the First Reich in Rome, the Second Reich in Bismarck, and then the final Reich in what they're currently doing. So there's this very clear link between aesthetics and the realpolitik. Um, and then there's also you see this, what I found fascinating is that you see this filter down out of the command. So you see this filter to kind of the ordinary citizen, in that even like on concentration camps, they're marking prisoners' death with the Algiz rune, either inverted or upright, right? So if it's upright, it's life, right? The rune of life, and it's deliberately inverted on concentration camp cards to mark death. And we see this like into 1944 and 1945. So, and these are Germans marking these cards. These are, kind of your ordinary foot soldier. So this is a worldview which extended far outside of the command and was reinforced easily with music, like through your ordinary battalions, I guess.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that process of, I guess, all the things you just talked about there. There's sort of this intentional, I don't know how coherent it is, but it's an intentional cultural operation where I think the high command of the Nazis is trying to say this is what being a Nazi means, and maybe ultimately this is why these people need to die, or these people need to be subjugated, or we need to be the aggressors and the strong people. So when they are kind of getting into the mid 30s or even the late 30s now, they're now taking places over, and they're implanting their Nazi cultural soup, I guess you might call it. And do you think that that infusion of Nazi ideology, I guess, how big a role do you think that infusion of Nazi ideology ultimately plays in sort of the average Nazi soldier or SS member, or how big a role does that Nazi ideology play in the atrocities they later commit?
I mean, I think it's substantial. George Mosse wrote really extensively about this in the 80s, about basically the creation of the German man, the creation of the German person, in the Nazi context. And so I think once you've created an ideal, and this gets into like the gender studies weeds of the 90s, but in creating the prescriptive hegemonic group, right, you by definition create an other. So like the gender theorists say, to have man, therefore you've defined what woman is. To have white, you've defined what black is, right? I mean, these are social these are essentially socially described characteristics. You see this in countries where there's not a huge difference, for example, between like ethnicities of people who would be considered white. I mean, you can look at this in like the Austrian case, right, and say, well, there's Austrian Jews that are living next to Austrians that are living next to Austrian Roma. How can you possibly tell, right, from the outside looking in, that these people are not simply all Austrian? But of course, there's a racial distinction there, right? There's a racial distinction that's created culturally. And I think that this goes back in the Central European context. Those distinctions, those racial distinctions, go back hundreds of years, right? So if you look at creating racial alterity, I mean, the just within the 100 years before the Third Reich, the Pale of Settlement was dangerous for Jews in creating a specific area and specific jobs that could be held in what became then the bloodlands of Poland and Belarus and Eastern Ukraine, and right. I mean, the Pale of Settlement directly overlaps with what later were the bloodlands of the Third Reich. Um, or you see like in the Viennese context or in the Central European context, you see Roma for hundreds of years being used as conscripted labor and also as slavery within Europe, to create things like armor for the Habsburgs, right? So like some of the best armor in Europe were made by enslaved Romani people. So this is something where these racial characteristics go back really far, and so they're very deeply entrenched into ordinary society. Um, where I think that this is interesting when it comes down to kind of flashpoints of atrocity. So when you look at the Holocaust, when you look at decision making of ordinary men on the ground, the question that was asked by people like Daniel Goldhagen and Christopher Browning, they looked at the same police battalion, right? Two different books, two different historians. And they said, are these ordinary men doing horrifying things, or are these Hitler's willing executioners, right? Are these gung-ho, bloodthirsty, whatever? And I think the answer is yes, right? It's a little bit of both. I tend to kind of fall in the Christopher Browning camp of these are ordinary men, and they weren't necessarily in extraordinary situations. I mean, this was something which broke out all across Europe. There was violence all across Europe, including in the pre-war period, including in the Soviet Union. And what you see is only a certain percentage of men willing to shoot. You see things mediated very heavily on the front by things like alcohol, like psychotropic drugs, like Pervitin, like methamphetamine, essentially, and by music also. So like by social camaraderie. And I think what gets interesting is looking also at the distinction between kind of these ordinary foot soldiers and the crimes of like the Einsatzgruppen and the Wehrmacht, and then to look up kind of a level from that at the second level perpetrators of the SS, people like Kurt Franz. So I would say that the people Otto Globachnik assigned to run camps, so Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, those camps were in many ways much more brutal than the camps like Auschwitz and Majdanek, because they were run by this kind of second tier of perpetrators who were really dead set on proving themselves both genocidally and culturally to the Third Reich. They were a bunch of very, very nasty commandants. I mean, so of course was like Rudolf Hess at Auschwitz, right? But there's a ranking even amongst perpetrators and even amongst like a huge distinction, I would say, between the Wehrmacht and the SS.
It is interesting that you bring that up, because I think the true believers, like you said, who are trying to prove themselves ideologically and genocidally, it's almost, when you're reading accounts like I'm reading in your book, and Kurt Franz is having concentration camp inmates sing songs that he's forcing them to sing, and he's I don't know if it was him particularly in this case, but they're playing children's lullabies as they're
So
on loudspeakers, as they're sending kids to die, and it's almost like a supernatural level of evil at right. that point. And it's like you said, it's very interesting to think about these questions of were these outliers who are just horrible monsters, or were these just ordinary people who got corrupted along the way. But I guess we're kind of in the nitty gritty of the Holocaust now. So how would you say specifically the Nazis used music in particular to kind of facilitate the killings, maybe both in I guess you might call it the killing fields of kind of the Eastern Front, and also the concentration camps?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's my division. Like, I guess every other Holocaust scholar is kind of pre-Wannsee and post-Wannsee, right? So the Wannsee Conference of 42 sets up the concentration camp system, and everything before that is like the crimes of the Wehrmacht and the crimes of the Einsatzgruppe in the East. Um, and so what actually, that's where I started. My research was on Holocaust in the USSR. And so that's what I started looking at. I started looking at Babi Yar and Botanovka and the massacres in Ukraine and moving up to Vilna. And something that jumped out at me very disturbingly was the use of compelled music and dance, not only at sites of execution, but as entertainment for perpetrators, and a very specific eradication of the human voice and eradication of music and culture along with people, right? There was this very intentional use of musical sadism. The other thing that I saw pop up over and over going through testimonies from the Eastern Front was the creation of this kind of musical Jew trope. So when you go today to like Krakow or Warsaw, you'll see, like, for example, little Jewish figurines being sold, like along with other memorabilia and like souvenirs and things. You'll see these like little Jewish statues being sold. And these little Jewish statues are often holding like €1 coins or like little zloty coins. And like that's already like that's already gets into this realm of anti-Semitism, right? And um like, Jews are money hungry or what have you. But what you see them holding as a secondary thing, which I found very interesting, was musical instruments. So they'd be holding a clarinet or a violin. And there is a very nasty trope of especially Hasidic Ashkenazi Jews, um, as being music loving, right? As mostly men. Again, like I hardly ever see Jewish women being represented in the Hasidic kind of tropes, but of Jewish men, very similar to like a minstrel trope of playing music and dancing in circles together and singing joyfully. And this is something that we do. This is something that Hasidic Jews do. They dance on Simchat Torah. They dance on, at Farbringen. They dance for holidays like Lag BaOmer. So this is a part of the culture, but it's kind of parodied in the way that a lot of like minstrel tropes from the American South are parodied, right? They're these kind of distorted, gross takes on stuff. What I saw over and over again in testimony from the East was these tropes enacted at people right at the moment of violence. So, okay, Jews like dance and sing in a circle, again, almost always enacted at Jewish men. And it goes along with things like forcible beard cutting, burning religious material. So it was definitely conflating a cultural aspect of Judaism and klezmer and kind of Yiddish culture in the music with Jewish religious culture. It's like this whole conflated worldview of Jews, I guess. So you would see that enacted at the moment of violence. You would also, I found this extraordinary testimony of this man who was compelled to sing the Communist Internationale before he was shot. Um, and they asked that he sing it in either Hebrew or in Yiddish, which is like already patently ridiculous. The Communist Internationale would not be sung in Hebrew, it would be sung in Russian or possibly French. Um, but, and also like Hebrew would not be this guy's even third or fourth language. It'd probably be like his 10th, right? Behind Russian and Yiddish. And so it's extraordinary, first of all, that this was recounted by a survivor, like he survived this mass shooting, but also that this was something that they're compelling, kind of this Judeo-Bolshevik trope right at the moment of violence. But this is all very clandestine, right? This is individual soldiers having a good time and trying to mediate the violence that they're doing, um, in a very unofficial, unsanctioned way. So they're saying, this helps me shoot. They don't ever even really mention shooting women and children. It's just this kind of, they have their fun shooting the men. And then oftentimes they have a party, they have food brought from the village. They also mention bringing musical instruments. It's something where they need to mediate what they spent their day doing, a hard day's work you see in a lot of the kind of Nazi diaries home. What you see in the concentration camp system is you see a shift to where this violence is then codified in very intentional and very institutional ways. So instead of instruments that are brought in to entertain people for the perpetrator's amusement in a very hurried way, you see camp orchestras, right? So Auschwitz is a camp orchestra. They separately have a so-called gypsy band, right? That they allow people to keep their musical instruments, just entertain them. You see people like Kurt Franz make official bands. You see official camp songs for things like roll call and humiliation. So it's institutionalized in the camp system, and this stays until the bitter end of the war. So, like liberation of Buchenwald, liberation of Bergen-Belsen, you still see these orchestras and these bands for the entertainment of the SS.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of historical interest in particular with the Nazis, with drugs and alcohol
Yeah,
and how they used, substance abuse to moderate their moods and cope with the realities of what they were doing. But
sure.
I think it's almost in some ways more interesting to look at the musical aspect of things, because I think there are other ways to alter your emotions or your mood or your state than just drugs and alcohol. And
Sure.
I think in everyday life, most, I don't want to speak for most people, but I think a lot of people probably use music as a tool to, adjust their feelings or
Certainly. Yeah.
feel a certain way, maybe even more than drugs and alcohol. So it's interesting that, I think I want to get to the victims and how they kind of use music as well.
Yeah.
And hope we get to that later. But from the perpetrator perspective, do you think they're doing that? Like you said, there's that story of them making the Jewish victims sing the Communist Internationale before they kill them. Do you think that's a way to kind of make what they're doing fit with the Nazi propaganda and
Sure.
kind of make it seem like, oh, like they must be, communists, they must be the bad guys? Like, is that
Sure.
what was going on to some extent?
Certainly. I mean, I think that there's always, in the case of the East, a desire to prove that there's this connection between Judeo-Bolshevism and that the execution of people is not of civilians. It's of people like partisans or people who are a threat. So I think that that certainly maps on pretty directly. But it is really wild, the choices of what perpetrators are listening to. I mean, it's and like the durability of that throughout the war, that is just astonishing to me. I mean, we know that like Goering was listening to Ring, for example, before he gave the halt order at Dunkirk. This is wild, right? And it's not, this was also a point of interest to me, like just getting starting writing the book, was it's like, if you think about it, like take it in the American context or take it in the British context, right? Like if we found out that a general like went and did, I don't know, 15 grams of heroin and then like listened to Dolly Parton for 8 hours or something, we'd be like, what are you doing? Right? This guy is out of his mind. I mean, it's bizarre. The context really matters. It really matters what these people are listening to. And I agree. I mean, I think that I would hazard a guess. And again, this would be a very hard citation to find, but I would say there's like a lot more people who flip the radio on after a bad day or refuse to listen to a silent car driving home or whatever than like do heroin driving home, right? I mean, like,
Yep.
or drink and drive home. So I think that this is something which is clearly a psychologically modifying part of the Nazi experience and part of the camaraderie exercises in the East. I mean, we see them playing music after mass shootings. We know that there's a very famous image of the SS on one of their little summer retreats from Auschwitz, and they have a nice accordion and they're all playing together. And Mengele is right front and center with Rudolf Hess playing the accordion. So they're very linked to this. It's a big part of their social camaraderie. And what's interesting, I think, is what I was able to find of what they're actually playing. Right? It's not like German schmaltzy music from the interwar. It's not jazz. It's not popular songs. It is a lot of this Teutonic stuff, and it's a lot of classical music, which again shows this like really heavy reliance on high art culture. Again, that is bizarre, like in a field situation. Um, that is a really bizarre use of resources and intellectual capacity and everything else to not just kind of have the quick fix of a nice uplifting song, but really have this reliance on high art music and classical music, even in like a military field. That is bizarre. And you see that again, you see that with the command until the very end. Like they're commissioning Berlin Philharmonic until something like the 27th of April in 45, which is insane. That's mental.
Yeah.
um,
I guess when you kind of think about what it means to be a Nazi, it kind of makes sense at the end of the day, but it might not be something that you immediately kind of think about. But you mentioned Christopher Browning's book earlier, and one of my takeaways from that book was how they used the, loud music as a way to kind of, desensitize the troops during these killing operations during the Holocaust. And you might kind of take away from that, well, music was just kind of like a tool of genocidal um, operation. But what you're saying is it's much deeper than that. It's actually, there's a connection to what they were doing and how that connects to their identity.
Yeah.
And this was not, they were not just playing music just to like cover sounds or to make things really loud and make soldiers feel desensitized so they might be more willing to kill. There might be some elements of that, but there's more to it.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that like the use of loudspeakers. I mean, I know Christopher Browning talks about use of loudspeakers specifically. Like, I know he talks about Antifest, but he also talks about with the police battalion. Um, and yeah, that would absolutely be something because again, hearing music is probably highly preferable to hearing gunshots fired. But what you see most of the time is not the use of music. We think that, I mean, I certainly thought going in for the Holocaust in the East, especially where you're talking about very localized killings. I mean, it's hard if you're a local living next to like Treblinka. You probably know what's going on in Treblinka, right? Like your windows are covered in ash all the time. You probably have some idea of what's going on in Treblinka. You probably have some idea of what's going on, like at Auschwitz-Birkenau, right? I mean, this is operating for years. Like it's the smell, the like the pervasive pollution of things like the river. You have some idea of what's going on. So I think using loudspeakers somewhere like Auschwitz, yeah, it's probably pretty useless, right? I mean, it's dozens of kilometers wide. It's like you're not going to cover anything up. You can see the camp. But these localized killings, I thought there would certainly be an element, places like Reichskommissariat Ukraine. I thought there would certainly be an element of like, we don't want the townspeople to see what we're doing. I mean, yeah, it's like they would take people, a few kilometers out of the town, but the music that they were using, a couple of like accordions is not going to cover machine gun fire. No way. So it definitely is for the entertainment of troops. Singing certainly is not going to cover anything. If anything, what I would see is that they would request people to sing and they would shoot as they would go, which would actually diminish the sound, right? That would diminish the music that you're hearing. Um, yeah, it's very interesting.
As I was reading your book, I was thinking about another sort of trope or misconception about music during the Holocaust. I don't know if you've seen this movie, Life is Beautiful. And there's this sort of famous scene where I guess the idea of the movie is that kind of a dad is trying to shield his son from the horrors of the concentration camp, and he's kind of doing all these weird and wacky and funny things to kind of
Yeah,
make everything seem like a joke in order to conceal the realities of the concentration camp. So
right.
first of all, there's a whole lot of controversy with that, right? Because some people feel like if you're watching a movie like that, you're not actually taking away the realities of what life was like in a concentration camp,
Yeah,
um, and that's a serious problem. But I think one of the scenes in that movie is he kind of sneaks into like the concentration camp, you know, office and gets on the loudspeaker and plays this classical music that's beautiful, and it's kind of this moment of like humanistic celebration of living. And I think that's how a lot of when people think about music during the Holocaust, that might be their first kind of thing. It's like, oh, this was this thing that people had to kind of center them in humanity and keep them connected. Um,
yeah,
Reading your book, it's tough to it's tough to
yeah,
see that just based on the realities of what was going on. So maybe you could
yeah.
explain why that might be a bit of a misconception, even though it might be something we want to believe.
I mean, I might have also taken a pretty pessimistic view of things. I generally believe, I mean, my like taking the step back and looking at the larger approach, everybody wants to see themselves as a rescuer, right? Like nobody wants to see themselves as a perpetrator, certainly not as a victim, but definitely not as a perpetrator, right? Everybody says that they would be a rescuer. It's like, no, if you lived in the 1930s in Germany, you'd probably be a perpetrator, right? It's like same thing. If you were in the camps, people love to think that they would have clung to fragments of humanity, of things like music or religion. You even see this in post-war survivor testimonies of people who like are, for example, very religious. And they said, well, I kept kosher in the camps, or I kept holidays in the camps the best I could. And my sister didn't. And so that's why she perished. I mean, there's even controversial rabbis like there's controversial rabbis that have said things like no righteous Jews perished in the Holocaust. This is ludicrous, right? Um, and so I take a very hardline approach with it because I think that the likelihood is that for most people, it was nonstop, ceaseless terror until unfortunately they were killed. Um, However, there are instances of people like the pianist Spielmann who is able to hide and survive. I mean, like the phenomenal film A Pianist, right? It's about Spielmann's life. And he was able to hide and also survive the war in combination with his musical talent. There are phenomenally heroic people, like the people who put the Ringelblum archive together in the Warsaw Ghetto or the Onyx Shabbos archive in buried coffee cans that they put musical fragments in. They put musical scores in that um, into those coffee cans, which preserved Yiddish culture as we knew it, a lot of Yiddish culture from pre war Poland. So there are these moments of extraordinary heroism. There are people like Avraham Sutzkever and Shmerka Kecherginsky who were detained. They were in partisan brigades, and they took Yiddish music and folklore with them. There's a lot of preservation. I mean, I wouldn't say a lot, but there's disproportional preservation in things like partisan brigades, right? We do know that some composers were able to keep working in these in model artistic camps, like in Theresienstadt. So people like Victor Ullmann were able to work there for several years before they were eventually deported to Auschwitz. Um, Again, I tend to take like Deborah Dvork's take on that, that Theresienstadt was just an antechamber to Auschwitz, that it was the, you know, world stage for people to see what a concentration camp looked like, but it wasn't ever really intended to keep people alive. But we do see people clinging to this in the camps. What is very interesting is community solidarity amongst groups that is not compelled. So it's not like, oh, you were able to survive because you were serving in the camp orchestra, for example. Many of those people were also killed. So, like the violinist Alma Rose, who is actually the daughter of the violinist I talk about, Arthur Gold, in the Treblinka chapter. Alma Rose was a violinist. She was the leader of the camp orchestra at Auschwitz, and she ultimately was murdered. But in contrast to those kind of compelled settings, what's interesting are situations where like Sinti and Roma, for example, were allowed to keep instruments. Places like when they were first arrested and sent to Sachsenhausen in the 1930s, they were able to keep musical instruments initially. A lot of Sinti and Roma were able to keep, especially Roma, were able to keep musical instruments when they were arrested in occupied France. And then there was a so-called, again, gypsy band in Auschwitz-Birkenau where they were allowed to keep instruments. And this provided a great amount of community solidarity, comfort, preservation of those musical traditions because they're largely passed through the oral tradition. So we don't have, as far as I know, any surviving Sinti and Roma scores from the wartime period. I would love somebody to reach out to me if they have them. But
I mean, there's so many things there, but one thing you mentioned was the camp orchestra at Auschwitz. I think the average listener, person who's interested in history, might be like, "Wait, what?" Like, um, So I think in particular you looked at Treblinka, but
yeah,
they actually had, they would bring Jewish musicians in to play music at the concentration camp.
yeah.
Um, and honestly, it's very strange to read, and it's very difficult to read. One word you use is bacchanalian, where there's these mix of all these things happening at a concentration camp where
Mhm,
you have drugs, you have alcohol, you have desensitization, you have these
mhm,
musical, orchestras or just small kind of bands, and then you have Nazis who are killing people at the camps, and then that night they're feasting and
mhm.
partying, and there's orgies, and
Yep.
one of your quotes is music was an essential part of the camaraderie of violence. And again, it's kind of hard to take that life is beautiful, humanistic sort of approach when you're reading stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's always shocking when when people start looking at like concentration camps, you go, what do you mean there was an orchestra there? What do you mean? Like there was a zoo at Treblinka. Like, what do you mean? Why? Um, and it was largely for perpetrator entertainment. I mean, originally, again, people thought this was to ameliorate sound. So they would say, oh, the orchestra was by the gas chambers, or people would say, oh, the orchestra played to pacify people en route to the gas chambers. That's not the case. They would play typically like by the main gates, not the gate that people are thinking of Arbeit macht frei in Auschwitz, but near the gates where people would go to forced labor. So between Auschwitz 2 and Auschwitz 3, or the IG Farben factory, they would play music in the mornings to kind of like inspire people to hard labor, like to get the, they would play kind of like oompa music and upbeat music. They would also play, as far as I know, in Auschwitz, like very large scale Germanic music like Beethoven and Wagner, and actually no, not Wagner. Wagner was not performed in Auschwitz as far as I know. But like large scale Germanic works to again remind the people going to work of like who's in charge, like who's the superior group here. And so it was in some ways a privileged position for people. I know that like Mengele was a great classical music lover at Auschwitz. He would request private performances, but I say privileged with, kind of in quotes, because often these people, the musicians, were subject to things like more close interactions with the SS. They were subject to things like personal humiliation, even sexual violence. So this, for the Roma, for example, who were allowed to keep musical instruments, they were often the entertainment for the SS, and then they were subject to really brutal violence, where then they would be told, choose which children you want to be killed, or subject to sexual violence and all sorts of things. So it's this music was very intertwined with violence in the concentration camp system. In Treblinka, it was on a very microscopic level, but definitely at the whims of Kurt Franz. Where he had this little band of three, which was Arthur Gold, and we don't really know who the other two were. People have described it as being a clarinet player. People have described a cantor. So we think maybe two string players and a clarinet player. But he had this very personal band that he would like station outside the gas chambers to keep himself entertained. That he would instruct to like play really enthusiastically, like for his own celebration, not to like make people think that they were going somewhere different. And then there was also this compelled music that I would say was official music, like in that it was SS sanctioned or Nazi sanctioned within the camps, but it wasn't like by musicians. So things like Buchenwald had their own song that you had to sing all the time. Like guards would, not only at roll call, but like, hey, you lifting that boulder, go sing this song really enthusiastically. Or we know that Auschwitz had songs. Auschwitz had different songs kind of based on block and ethnicity and time period and things like that, because the camp was open so long. Treblinka had its own song. It was composed by a Czech Jew in the camp. And so they have these kind of like camp anthems and other forced entertainment, like these very prescriptive, removing your hat, like clapping your legs, clapping your hands, things like that during roll call, which I think fall under the banner of music and sound.
That was another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is sometimes there's this blurring of what is music, what is sound, and um, there's this giant German word that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce.
Sorry, I invented
but
words.
yeah, but basically you're talking about, in everyday life, we only tend to notice noise when it affects us, right? So
Right.
in particular, we notice noise that annoys us or
Sure.
is disorienting, right? Like the lawnmower outside the house, or when the TV's too loud, or when the fire alarm goes off. Like these are things that kind of grasp our attention and annoy us. And one of the things that I thought was super interesting was you're talking about this total soundscape at a place like a concentration camp, where you're getting the sounds of industrial killing, you're getting the screams, and you're getting the sounds of machinery and trains and fires, and you're also getting sort of these musical performances, and it's got to be just a strange sort of place to be psychologically. So
Yeah.
could you talk about how that kind of soundscape kind of works?
Yeah, so at the risk of getting too much into theoretical weeds, I mean, I invented this new term because I think there's been quite a lot written on violence and sound and sonic violence and things like that, particularly in the case of war, but also in the case of using things like loudspeakers in addition to tactics like waterboarding or bright lights and things like that, sonic tortures. So like Suzanne Cusick wrote a fantastic article about this. This was written about in the Chilean case about how they would put loudspeakers outside of Chilean prisons, which would also kind of terrorize the surrounding people because surrounding people would be aware that then violence was going on in the prison whenever the loudspeakers would come on. We know that this is the case in Kim's North Korea. So there's a lot written about violent sound. And one of the things that I find most compelling is a book by J. Martin Daughtry, where he talks about the bellophonic sound of war, or literally, so bella, like originally from war, and then phonic is sound. And to me, I didn't like the term itself because it sounds pretty. It sounds like war is beautiful, right? It sounds like beautiful. Which is not what he intended, and the book is extremely well written. But it's about this kind of totalizing, like he's talking about the Iraq War, which to me has immediate parallels to Afghanistan, but with kind of dust everywhere and debris everywhere, and then you have also this sound, right? There's like you have shrapnel sound and artillery sound and all of this all the time. And so I came up with this idea of Gesamtgewalttätig Klang, which is literally total, so Gesamt and then violent, gewalttätig or violenced sound, Klang, or tone, I guess. And it's building on this idea of kind of like assault of all of your senses, right? So Terence Dupre writes about excremental assault in the concentration camps, that there's this smell which gets into your clothes, and it's like this stench of decay and death, and it gets into everything, and you can't shake it even years later. And you see this talked about in survivor testimony. You see survivors talk about, I couldn't eat a steak for 40 years because it smelled like crematoria. I couldn't use certain types of laundry detergent because it smells like ashes, it smells like lye. um, People talk about the smell thing for years in survivor testimony, and what I notice is that people are also talking about the sound thing for years in survivor testimony. And this is interesting when you're talking to people who are not musicians, right? So you start pulling testimonies, you start looking at oral histories, of course, which directly relate to music. But then what I noticed is that people would just be randomly in the middle of a testimony about Treblinka talking about, oh my God, the sound of this excavator and it's constantly going. And when you start piecing it together, you get a sense of the camp of, you have these two camps. Treblinka 2 is massive. It's these immolation pits. It's multiple gas chambers. I think at one point they had 16. It's this just this soundscape and scape of death and chaos. And then you have Treblinka 1, which is this relatively small processing area for things like clothes. It's where the trains arrive. There's the very few survivors who are in the camp who are allowed to return to barracks, and it's where the SS headquarters are, like their commandant offices are. And those are like two separate worlds, right? They're literally separated by this thing that the SS are calling a tube or a chute or a tunnel to heaven. And there's this great sense of disorientation in the forest. Um, Forest sounds are then merging with this kind of soundscape of death. What I think is really striking is that also when we think about violent sound, we think about things like gunshots or screams or things which would be explicitly violent. But one of the testimonies, like when you piece it together, that's the most horrifying is these survivors are all talking about how fire and like crackling fire sounds horrifying to them, right? And it's because their strongest association are with these mass immolation pits, which could be 500 meters by 500 meters. I mean, these are massive, right? They're like, I mean, that's just like we can't even comprehend what that might look like, right? It's like hell on earth. And so, like something like fire, they're associated with the crackling of bones, not with hearth and home, right? Or this constant excavator digging. And if we try to imagine it in a non genocidal perspective, it's like everybody has a different sensitivity to sound in their own home, right? Or sound in their own, like what might cause them irritation. But certainly if we have something like a little smoke alarm that beeps all the time, we're like, oh, what is that? I need to go need to go deal with that. Or you have something in your house, you have a lamp that makes too much of that electric noise or something. You need to go unplug it when you sleep at night because you can hear it. And I certainly think everyone also has more of an experience of total silence, of things like when the power goes out, or you're at a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and how that contrasts with kind of our normal life. And so to remove yourself from that is also to understand on a smaller level what that would be like between the concentration camp sound world and outside of that camp as a sound world, and how immediately traumatic and immersive that would be to be there.
Yeah. I don't know how historical or scientific this is really, but I was, as I'm reading kind of about that stuff, I'm just thinking about music in general. Um, sometimes, a great piece of music kind of takes you to that weird, you know, again, I don't want to say supernatural, but just kind of like a different place psychologically.
Right.
Um, and, and you can't even imagine what all those sounds and, that kind of soundscape would take you to at a place like, Treblinka or Auschwitz or,
Right.
whatever. But yeah, I think one thing you mentioned earlier was that the this sort of stuff that we're seeing in the concentration camps related to the music and the sounds, it doesn't stop when the Soviets, or the Americans show up, like
Right.
even on their, as they're fleeing these concentration camps and there's these kind of death marches, like you might think that the sort of the Nazi mask would fall off, and a lot of these
Hmm.
perpetrators would try to, minimize what they're doing, but um, to some extent that's not the case at all.
Right.
Could you maybe talk about after the camps and sort of the end of the war?
Yeah, that was the more shocking chapter to research. I mean, I thought certainly that I would see SS, because we know the SS were guarding people on death marches, right, across from these camps, and this is hundreds of miles in many cases. So I thought certainly we would see a point where they were shedding their SS identity, putting on prisoner garb, and saying, no, 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 we're not, right, we're just a little bit better fed prisoner. I thought we would see that widespread. I was expecting to see that in all sorts of cases. And I went through probably 500 testimonies from death marches and civilian bystanders and all sorts of things. And I couldn't find one. I couldn't find one where an SS officer put on prisoner garb. I found instances where they would hide underneath prisoners, like on trains, for example, so they would look down and just see this prisoner transport. I saw cases where they would, at the very end, try to take off just the like insignia from their hat or cover up a tattoo or something, but they left their uniforms on. Like they left all of their other insignia on. And this was only very rare cases that they would even try to take like the death head insignia off of their hat. I mean, this is what I think it shows is it shows a real um first of all, commitment to National Socialism and commitment to the ideals that put them there, because these are not like the best and the brightest, as it were. Like this is not the command at this point. These are whatever junior officers were left in the camps to deal with the people who they couldn't quote liquidate before they left the camps, right? In places like Auschwitz, they left thousands of prisoners and children and women and stuff just in the camp for the Red Army to find. They said, "Oh, they'll die of exposure before the Soviets even get here." I mean, they gassed thousands of people at the end of the war, towards the end of 1944. So these were not some like phenomenally diehard leaders who were leading these death marches across Europe, nor were they the people guarding camps like at Sachsenhausen and Bergen-Belsen and the camps that were liberated by the Western Allies. So I think that's extraordinary, the durability of identity. The other thing that I think cynically that it shows is a lack of culpability. They didn't think that what they were doing and the people that they were marching would have subjected them to Soviet trial, to American trial, or to legal intervention. I mean, cynically, I think that if they thought that what they were doing was wrong in any capability, then they thought that they still wouldn't have been prosecuted for it. And to some extent, hey, that's true. So, like, unfortunately, like in the German context, we only see the first of these trials coming out like in the 1960s. 1961 is Eichmann, it kicks things off. It's like the Auschwitz trials are much later. The Ulm trials are later. I mean, we're seeing stuff in the 60s and 70s. Kurt Franz didn't stand trial until the 60s. He was released from prison in the 80s. So it's like, to some extent, this is true, right? What I think is comedic, being also a Soviet historian, is that they didn't fear the Soviet army. And they didn't fear culpability from the Soviets, who were very happy to find anybody German speaking and send them to the Gulag. So from the Soviet perspective, I think that they found literally anybody who they perceived to be German speaking, including like Yiddish speaking prisoners, and sent them to the Gulag. So you see kind of retribution on the extreme side, the other direction in the Soviet context.
Maybe flipping gears towards the victims here. We had kind of said that there's certainly a lot of kind of misconceptions about how prevalent and important music was for um, people in concentration camps. Um, so I guess to what extent did victims sort of use music either in the camps or after the war was over to kind of recalibrate themselves and um, you know um, kind of reestablish normalcy, if that is even possible.
Yeah. So I think this is also um is really important to look at like the death marches and kind of the end as people are aware of liberation. That was also one of my questions was how do people know that they're liberated, right? And like one of the big things was sound, like listening to voices that were not in German, but then also like music being played or friendly people coming in. Like, how do you know that somebody's friendly coming in, right? There were perpetrators of many different nationalities. Um, and you also might not recognize a language like English or even necessarily Russian if you're not from a country originally that you ever would hear that language. Um, so I think that that was interesting upon liberation. On death marches, what we start to see um, is we see um, people finding like religious fragments which were important to them from pre-war and even that they might have kept with them. So you see this definitely in like religious Jewish testimonies from death marches where people would like be singing prayers along the way. You see people start to return possibly in desperation, but possibly in hope to religious tenets. So like very famously, a woman leaving Auschwitz um, asked an SS officer for his knife because she delivered a baby during a death march. And she said, "Oh, can I please have your knife?" And the SS officer said, "Why? Do you want to end it all?" And she said, "No, because it's my son's 8th day and I'm going to make sure that he has a circumcision because if he's going to die, I want him to die a Jew." And so you see people turning to religious practice again. You definitely see this in the DP camps in the immediate post-war, where almost immediately there's like Sukkot celebrations. So first of all, it would have been Shavuot. We didn't really see a lot of people get things together for Shavuot. So by summer, by like June of 45, there wasn't much in the DP camps. But by the fall holidays, we start to see postcards of people reaching out with religious stuff, with songs. Communities are piecing back together based on like, oh, you're from this community because you know this song, you grew up with this religious tradition and so on. The thing which I think is probably most extraordinary, the most extraordinary use of music post-war, like in a clandestine sense, was where Jewish children were placed with Gentile neighbors, so places like Poland. And Rabbi Yosef Shlomo went, so Kahneman. Anyway, Rabbi Yosef Shlomo, he went around to these different orphanages and to different people's homes, and they would say, "Okay, but you only have 15 minutes to find all the Jewish children or something, and you got to get out. Like we're on a tight schedule, dude." And so the fastest way he could think of it was he would go into the orphanage, he would cover his eyes, and he would start to say the Shema prayer. And the kids who would cover their eyes, he knew that they grew up in a religious home. So he could at least find like religious Jewish children just with the first few words of the Shema, which is an extremely short prayer, right? It's like 15 seconds long. So that's this extraordinary use of music, which again, these children wouldn't have heard Yiddish or Hebrew for up to 5 years through the war, but they were able to reunite hundreds, if not thousands, of children with that.
Yeah, so I think where it's hard to talk about this stuff in the modern day
Yeah,
and not and not think about the present moment.
yeah,
And it certainly feels like there is definitely a rise in what you might call Holocaust denialism.
sure.
And I think actually even deeper than that, just kind of the sense that it's not important. And I'd be very curious to get your thoughts on where do you think cultural understanding of the Holocaust is at from the mainstream and in the academic world, and
Yeah,
why do you think there seems to be an increase in these sort of Holocaust denial?
yeah. I mean, on the kind of popular front, I think AI is a huge contributor to this. and the ability to generate images of whatever has made people question historical images. We don't have a really rigorous kind of public humanities training in like what's authentic historical fact and what's not. Um, and so, like when I train students, I almost always have an AI assignment in my classes where they need to generate, for example, Holocaust denial, and then they need to rebut it, right? And they need to think logically and critically about this and use the skills that they're being trained in as academics to like actually create a logical reply to this. Um, on the academic side, what I've seen is, and this filters into the public, right? This filters into public discourse, but there's a large fixation on post-colonial studies and violence within post-colonial contexts, colonial and post-colonial, and this excludes for some reason the Holocaust. Sometimes, I'm not saying generally because of academics, I'm saying there is a strain of thought that would seek to exclude the Holocaust based on reading modern day Israeli politics as being colonial. Um, and while I think that there's a case to be made for, I'm not a contemporary Israeli historian, I'm not a contemporary historian of the Middle East. I think that you can read contemporary settler colonial politics onto aspects of Middle Eastern policy, certainly. But to link those two things and say that the Holocaust is not a colonial conflict is inaccurate, right? And I think that the better read is to say that the Third Reich and the Soviet Union are both colonial empires. You have to make the case for both of those, and then say that the Holocaust is yet another example of the bloodlands or the shatter zones or whatever you want to think of as between empires, right? And I think that that's going to be an important reframing as we're nearly a century out from these events, to situate the Holocaust with, say, Armenia or other colonial fractures. And why does genocide occur under the cover of war, and to whom and where? And so I think I think transnational history of the Holocaust is extremely vital. I think that the expansion that we've seen in academia and within Holocaust studies to look at the Holocaust in the East and the Soviet Union is well founded because it more parallels other colonial genocide. Um, and it provides a less kind of shock value horrific template to look at what leads to genocide and what leads to warfare. It's much easier to understand how Babi Yar occurred, how individuals were motivated to mass shootings, than it is to try to go from dehumanization and removal of rights in 1939 to Auschwitz, right? And to medical experimentation and to gassing 20,000 people a day. That is a much harder leap to make. It is a much easier leap to understand how militaries can be converted to genocidal aims. And so I think that that's an important like shift in Holocaust studies. What I'm encouraged by is there's a lot of museums now, like Museum of Jewish Heritage has a fantastic exhibit on the rescuers from Denmark that integrates things like generative AI into like having an actor who's pretending to be a survivor talk to you, like talk to children, for example. So that's a really great use of things. There's a generative AI project about the Gulag coming out of Bulgaria. There's a bunch of really great projects like this. Like there's the Holocaust survivors that you can talk to in the museum in Skokie, Illinois, they recorded testimonies and popular answers. So these are innovative ways to get the public talking. And I think that for for my putting my 2 cents in where I probably shouldn't as a contemporary historian, I think that for Israel to adequately distance itself from Holocaust studies and for these to not become conflated events, right? Israel, first of all, needs to take a much more active role, specifically at the level of their museums and their academic study of the Holocaust, in recognizing the genocide of the Sinti and Roma. They needed to integrate Soviet testimony much more earlier. Like they did not integrate Soviet testimony into Yad Vashem, for example, until the late 1990s. And that is a huge error, right? I mean, something like 40% of the country is post-Soviet. So these are errors that the Israeli government focused a lot on the survivors of camps and needs to now embrace the stories of exiles, the stories of the Jews who were trapped under like Soviet domination, I guess, for 60, 70 years after the Holocaust, and also the experiences of non-Jews during the Holocaust, like Sinti and Roma.
Do you think social media is a net positive or net negative for
Ooh.
Holocaust studies.
I think it can be a net positive. I mean, I just saw this week where there was some Apocrypha History Channel that had made a bunch of fake survivor stories or fake victim stories and had used AI generated images. I think it can be a net positive, um, but I think that generally for society, it's a net negative because we consume essentially waste of time content generally, when there's this plethora of knowledge. You can read almost any book you want to online. You can lay your hands on like the most beautiful knowledge in the world, like all the way from the Renaissance to present. And it's like instead we watch cat videos for what purpose, you know? I mean, the one that I give here's my answer to that. The one that I give to my students is I put up um 20 at the start of my world history class, I put up 25 current or past important world leaders, right? Churchill, like even evil people, Pol Pot, whatever. 25 global leaders that they should know. And I have them write them down, right, with their names, and they get 5 to 10 of them in a good class. And then I put up 25 people like Dixie D'Amelio and TikTok celebrities and whatever, and you get all 25 of them. And
That's awesome.
it's basically like a hey, shame on you, right? Like read a book. You have one of the most powerful supercomputers in the world in your hand. Like maybe look it up. Hey.
Yeah. So last question, maybe, and I'll let you get out of here. You did mention the role of museums, and I know you worked at the Holocaust Museum, I believe.
Yep.
Um, so maybe it's a bad time to be a museum these days. Do you see future crisis happening where places like the Holocaust Museum kind of lose centrality or lose importance, and therefore we lose primary sources and archives and records, or do you not worry about that so much?
I'm not super worried in the US and the Central European context, US, British, and Central European context. Also, not really the Israeli context. Um, those museums, yes, of course, they have federal funding. Yes, of course, that federal, like, there's things under freeze now. There'll be a different administration, then there'll be 40 jobs open, and then there'll be another freeze in 4 years and so on. I mean, I was there during furlough, I was there during the Kavanaugh hearings and stuff, the district shut down for a week and whatever. Things happen. But why I'm less worried about that in, again, the American, Central European, and Israeli context is because those museums also have enormous amounts of private funding. So I think that if we want to preserve things as historians, there's huge organizations that they also sponsor things like fellowships, and they maintain the collections, and they donated personal family collections, like the entire Chappelle Center, which is now the new kind of research arm of the U.S. Holocaust Museum, that has an enormous amount of private donations from the Chappelle family. Um, I believe they also have federal funding, of course, because they have federal employees. But those things are so well privately supported. And I think that, especially when there's contraction at more official levels, what you see is increased like family interest and increased foundational interest. Cynically, there's also institutions like the Ford Foundation that have a lot to answer for with anti-Semitism. I know that a lot of the institutions in Germany, for example, are sponsored by Daimler-Benz, or by Bayer, right? So it's like they have institutional and corporate responsibilities that outlive this generation. And also, fortunately, once you get archives and things set up, you're not looking at paying for acquisitions and paying for rights and things like that. You're maintaining existing collections, which is less costly than establishing new institutions and new research and things like that. What I do see is that we're going to have a shift in people who are trained in things like library sciences. We're going to have fewer people who are able to do that with the rise of AI. So those jobs are going to become very, very scarce and very competitive. Even academic jobs, like academic researcher jobs, are going to be replaced at lower levels by generative technology, I think. So simple things like indexing, eventually we won't need to hire people to do. As sad as that is, it's always nice to see somebody's personal touch on things, but I think that's the way we're moving. So that's going to be where the shift, I think, in academia is. What's unfortunate is that countries, we saw this in the case of Afghanistan, but also now with Russia and especially with Ukraine, is those archives are sealed and in many cases destroyed. So a lot of the phenomenal archives in Kiev and also in Kherson have been destroyed and bombed. And this is devastating, right? This is devastating for the research community. I know people that were trying to evacuate documents, and you just can't do things fast enough. So
Yeah, I definitely appreciate you walking us through your book, and
Thank you so much.
there's a ton of interesting stuff in there about um, the rise of Nazi Germany and cultural considerations and the Holocaust itself and the war itself. So
Great.
um, appreciate you walking us through that and giving us some modern thoughts as well. So
Yeah,
was there anything else you wanted to add?
I think that's great. Thanks so much for having me on and for
Okay.
your interest in the book.
Yeah, definitely appreciate it, and have a great day.
Thanks. Take care.
See you. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes, video essays, behind the scenes content, and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways by subscribing and leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for my email newsletter, which has some written pieces and podcast updates every now and then. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. That's it for now.